All right, I guess this is as good time to start as any. Hello, and welcome to the 27th Annual Texas Book Festival. My name's Katie Vine. I'm a staff writer at Texas Monthly, and we're going to be talking about NASA and space science firsts today with 3 books that highlight big firsts in science, space science. Wonders All Around with Bruce McCandless III on the far left here. He wrote about his, yay, all right. He wrote about his father, Bruce McCandless II, and his groundbreaking spacewalking accomplishments throughout 2 decades as an astronaut during the Apollo and Skylab eras. Jennifer Ross-Nazzal's Making Space for Women, featuring the women of NASA throughout its history. And Through the Glass Ceiling to the Stars, Jonathan Ward and Colonel Eileen Collins' book about Collins' esteemed career. I'm going to give some quick introductions and then interview the panel, which will be followed by about 15 minutes of questions for the audience. Normally we would have a microphone, but I'm told in this situation you're just going to have to talk really loud when we get to that point, just project. When we're all done, please remember to grab a book for sale down here on Congress Avenue, courtesy of Book People, and get it signed at the author's tent right after this conversation. And I'm told that if you do post any photos on social media, please tag the festival with @TexasBookFest or #TexasBookFest. All right, let's start with the intros. Please silence your phones. Colonel Eileen Collins earned a place in history as the first American woman to pilot and later command a space mission. Collins' love of aviation began as a child in her hometown of Elmira, New York, which hosts the National Soaring Museum. At age 20, she used money saved from part-time jobs to take flying lessons. And in 1978, she was selected as one of the first 4 women admitted to the pilot training program at Vance Air Force Base. In 1979, she became the first woman flight instructor at Vance. Collins flew the space shuttle on 4 missions between 1995 and 2005, and her flight highlights include joint operations on the Russian space station Mir and deployment of the Chandra X-ray Observatory. On her final shuttle flight, she commanded the return to flight mission after the tragic Columbia accident. Jonathan Ward, her co-author, his joy of bringing the space program to life for the public began in high school when he served as a tour guide for the Smithsonian's National Air and Science Museum, Space Museum. He's a fellow at the Royal Astronomical Society, a NASA Solar System ambassador, and a cruise ship enrichment lecturer in space exploration. In addition to his collaboration with Colonel Collins, he'll be discussing today, he authored 4 books on American space history, including the 2018 book, Bringing Columbia Home, The Untold Story of the Lost Space Shuttle and Her Crew. Jennifer Ross-Nazzal is the historian for the NASA Johnson Space Center, an amazing one at that, I can tell you, as a reporter who's benefited from her generosity. She's a 2-time recipient of the Society for History and the federal government's Charles Thompson Prize, and the author of Winning the West for Women, The Life of Suffragist Emma Smith DeVoe. Bruce McCandless III grew up next door to the Johnson Space Center during the Apollo and Skylab eras, graduated from Plan 2 honors program at UT, and went on to earn an MA from the University of Reading in England and a JD from University of Texas School of Law. In addition to this book that he's written about his father, Bruce is the author of the novels Sour Lake and In the Land of Dead Horses. So let's begin. I was wondering if everybody could just kind of go through and talk about your relationship to being first. And I was wondering if Eileen, if you could go first and talk about just sort of the benefits and drawbacks and just what being first meant to you, for better or worse. Sure.
Thank you, Jonathan. I want to tell you, Jonathan, the book would not have happened without Jonathan. So he did a great job keeping me on schedule and turning on my mic and things like that. So what it's like to be a first, I think, how did that happen to me? It could have been somebody else. It just happened to be the way history was taking place, where women were starting to get the opportunity to fly in the military, which happened in 1976. I was still in college. And then in 1978, NASA selected their first women to be space shuttle astronauts. And that was the year I graduated from college. So I think part of it was my timing, okay? And then the other part was just I love to fly, so I applied to the program. I always tell young people, you got to apply or you're not going to get in. Yeah. They're not going to come and get you. You have to go and get them. And then as far as being the first, and I'll just keep this short, I think it's just doing your best job. Yeah. You have a passion for what you're doing, do your best job, stay focused on the mission of your organization. It's not about me, it's about the mission and what you're doing.
Is that how you did you feel pressure? Like, or were you able to not feel pressure because you focused on that?
Yeah, well, there was definitely, if you look at the first women that went through pilot training in the Air Force, so I was in maybe the third class, but I was in the first at my base. So everybody was watching us, and the questions were, how are the women doing? What were their grades? Did they pass their check rides? You just can't think about that. You just have to every day do the best that you can. Because if you worry about what other people think about you, then it's just too much stress.
Were there colleagues of yours who kind of did get distracted, and you think it?
So there were 4 of us women that went through Advanced Air Force Base, and one of them did not graduate because she had trouble landing the airplane. So I think the way they treated us and graded us was the same as the guys. We were not given any special, let's get the women through kind of treatment. It was like, hey, we're grading you the same as the guys. So there were only 4 of us, so 3 of us made it through, so 75% success rate. It's a small sample size, so it's kind of hard to draw a conclusion from that. But in the long run, I think the women were treated the same as the men. And yes, there was pressure, but like I said, you can't think about that. Because if I would think about that all the time, it would just distract me from studying. So I tried. And the other good thing was our boss, the wing commander running the base, said no public relations, interviews, TV, you can't do any of that. And that was good because that kept us focused and not distracted.
Who wants to go next? Who wants to go next as far as what your relationship is to being first? You want to go, Bruce?
Well, I'm the third, so
Yeah.
I can't really speak to being the first. But
What being the first meant to your family,
right,
father,
no, I'm just kidding.
yeah.
So I wrote a book about my dad, who was the second, Bruce McCandless, but he was the first man to fly the manned maneuvering unit, something he'd spent something like 18 years at NASA to develop, and you've probably seen photographs of him. He's the guy in the jetpack that was developed during the shuttle era. And I think being first meant a lot to him, at least in part because he spent so much of his career developing this thing and figuring out how to fly it, and spent literally hundreds of hours in the simulator up at Martin Marietta in Denver. In fact, he felt like he was grossly overtrained by the time he got out into space. And so I think he would have. I think it was important for him to fly the first mission with the MMU. I think he would have flown all the flights with the MMU if they'd given him a chance, because he really enjoyed it, and it turned out to be a fabulous flying machine. It lives on in the form of the SAFER device. I think that's the self-assisted vehicle for emergency rescue or something like that the astronauts wear on the International Space Station these days. So yeah, it was he had a lot of tribulations in his career, but everything worked out well, and he was happy to have been the first person to fly that thing.
What did it mean for your family? Like, because I know you said that as a kid.
A relief. It was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a relief. I mean, Dad waited a really, really long time to finally get a flight, and he persevered through a lot of waiting, a lot of uncertainty, because I think Eileen could probably verify this, but it was always hard to know who was going to get the next flight and why. So he had some frustrations with that, and we had a fairly small family, 2 kids, 2 adults, and we felt the frustration with him. So when he finally got that mission, it was a big relief for all of us, and we're still happy for him.
Did he talk about it all the time, like at the dinner table and that kind of thing?
Yeah, we got a pretty steady diet of space news at the table, and it's funny, oddly enough, I wasn't particularly interested in space growing up, as I write about in the book, but when it came time to write the book about my dad, I found out that I actually did remember a few things that he'd instructed us on as we sat eating our dinner, our steamed vegetables and that sort of thing. So. Yeah.
I wanted to say one of the things about being first, which I really admired about Bruce McCandless and about Eileen, is that being first with the idea that you've now opened the door and other people are going to come through with you, that you're not just doing it as yourself for your own ego or something like this. This is starting something. Somebody's got to be the first one to do something, but who's going to follow along and learn from you? You know, the Russians were the first person to put a woman in space with Valentina Tereshkova, but it was 19 years before they put the next woman in space again, and that was only because NASA had 6 women astronauts in the first space shuttle class. So that was clearly a publicity stunt, whereas with Eileen flying her first mission, and then there ended up being 2 other women pilots and 1 other woman commander after her in the space shuttle program. Same with her being the female flight instructor. There were others that followed along behind her. And so it was a situation, again, of not being focused on her, but how are we creating opportunities for other people that are going to be how is the program going to be enriched by these opportunities that we've created for other people? And I think, you know, one of the things to be thinking about, even I was thinking about in reading your book about your father, was that even though he had spent all these years developing the MMU, you know, nobody owed him anything. You know, NASA didn't have to let him fly that mission. He clearly deserved that. He had trained himself exquisitely for that role, the same as Eileen had trained herself perfectly to fill the role that she did. So they were both the low-risk person to put in that job. And if you're ever going to be first at something, make sure you're the low-risk person.
I wanted to touch on being the first. One of the women that I featured in the book is Kathy Sullivan. She's one of the first 6 women to be named as an astronaut. And of course, in 1982, word came down that Sally Ride was going to be the first American woman to fly in space. And she talked to me about how her pride was sort of hurt because she, of course, would like to have gone first, but Sally got that nod. And she remembers on the day of launch, unlike all of her crewmates and colleagues, she actually decided to go do a talk. And she wasn't there in JSC. And the crew was actually supposed to return to Cape Canaveral. They were supposed to be the first crew to return there. Well, it turns out that they ended up landing at Edwards Air Force Base. Well, that presented a problem, actually, for the folks at Kennedy Space Center because there were a lot of VIPs there who were really excited to meet Sally Ride, the first American woman to fly into space. And so they went around the astronaut office looking for any female astronaut they could find. And she was one of them. They said, okay, well, you're going to go, you're going to represent. And she went out there and she decided at that moment when she stepped off the plane and saw the crowds, you know, this is overwhelming. I'm glad Sally has a few hours to really digest what happened, you know, what she just experienced, because before long it's not going to be hers. And also, if this is what you get for going first, you can have it. And she told me that's what she told Sally Ride. So, you know, being first isn't always what it's all cracked up to be, right?
You know, an interesting question also, what is it like to be the second? Because I think, you know, NASA's going to pick the first woman to walk on the moon probably fairly soon after this Artemis mission flies. And I don't know if I'd want to be her, but there's about 12 women in the astronaut office now. One of them is going to be picked to be the first woman to walk on the moon. I don't know if I'd want to be in that environment.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be like, who's it going to be?
Yeah.
You know, going to work every day wondering who is it going to be. And it may or may not be a good thing.
Right.
So
Yeah.
depending on some people like that and some don't.
Right. Well, that leads me to my next question, which is the role of chance in all this. I mean, you all have stories in all these books about a key person or key people who facilitated movement towards a goal, or in some case, presented a hurdle. Could you each tell a story or two about the roles of chance, the role chance played for you?
Oh, sure. I'll say, you know, I looked at, Katie, you sent us a sort of a preview of some of these questions. I looked at that when I thought, well, I don't know if that applies to my dad, really. He was not the sort of person who believed in chance. He was the sort of person who believed in eliminating chance, whether it was bad luck or good luck, by repetition and planning and contingency plans and everything. And I think NASA has some of that mindset. But the more I got to think about it, I realized that if it hadn't been for the launch of Sputnik in 1957 in October, he would never have become a pilot and never would have gone on to become an astronaut. He had his heart set on becoming a submariner at the time, and had been really impressed with America's first nuclear submarine, the Nautilus, which was a tremendous piece of engineering in its own right. So when Sputnik was sent up, it really changed his whole career path. So I don't know if that's exactly luck, but it is I guess it's happenstance of a sort.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess I would say, talk about chance and coincidence. It was 11 years ago today that I met Eileen Collins for the first time at an autograph show. And so, I mean, and who knew? I would never, ever have guessed when I asked her for her autograph 11 years ago that I'd be sitting up on a stage with her, having worked with her on her book. And happenstance, we worked together on my previous book about the Space Shuttle Columbia accident. She wrote the epilogue for that, and I'd been on her for several years to have somebody write her memoirs. And then chance, COVID happened. Our schedules freed up, and Eileen called me and said, "Are you still interested in working on my autobiography with me?" And so, when chance is there, you've got to be. I think you've got to recognize that opportunity is put in front of you. You've got to be willing to step out of your comfort zone and do it. And hopefully you've got the preparation that's going to allow you to be able to make the most of that opportunity when it comes.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, I think most of what's happened in my life is not from chance, other than, I was born, as an astronaut, you have to be born in a healthy body. Because the medical standards are so strict. So I think I was lucky. I almost didn't get in because my eyes were a tiny bit off, but that was, I think, maybe the luck of the doctor I had that day. He goes, "Well, you're so close to 2020. You're 2020.
Could you tell that story? Because you also had to really advocate for yourself in one of those situations. Could you tell that story about?
Oh, you mean, yeah. Well, I don't know if this is the one you're thinking of or not, but I like to tell the story about, so I applied to the test program. I was 20 years old. Test program, women flying in the Air Force, flying military airplanes. So test program, so I applied to it. They sent me in for the medical exam, and I flunked the eye exam. And I was 20/25 in one eye and 20/20 in the other eye. And actually the 20/25 was the distant vision. So I went home crying. I was like, this was my life's goal. I really wanted to fly. My colonel that was running the detachment, his name is Colonel Vernon Hagen. He's passed away now, bless his soul. But he called me in the office and said, "Miss Collins, I'm going to send you back in 2 weeks to get that eye exam again. I want you to just don't study so much and rest your eyes. We'll send you back." So I bought all these carrots because my parents told me carrots for your eyes. I ate so many carrots that my fingers turned orange. I am serious. Try it sometime. Like 2 weeks of carrots, my fingers turned orange, and I was a student at Syracuse University, which was orange, so it kind of fit in really good with our football team at the time. But I went back to take the test again, and I was 20/20, and so I passed the test. But then I went to pilot training. I had to pass the test there again. That was the guy that said, "Oh, you're so close, I'm just going to write you off." But the interesting thing is I went through all of pilot training with a little substandard vision in one eye, and I'm here to say I graduated, they gave me glasses. And I was a so much better pilot with glasses. I mean, you might, obviously it sounds totally obvious to everybody here, but when you're flying formation, you got a tiny little airplane like 2 miles off in the distance. If you have good vision, you can tell what kind of plane it is, the heading differential, you can tell like your closure rate. All of that is so much better with good vision. So you really need to have good vision to be a pilot. And just have to have good health. So, really to answer your question about chance, I was born healthy, and I don't take that for granted at all.
Didn't get air sick. I know there were a couple of people
I never
who
got
fell
air
out
sick.
of
I
training.
never got airsick until I was pregnant, and I kept flying, and I felt kind of sick when I was pregnant. But
Yeah.
otherwise, no.
Yeah, because it seems like there were a few times in the book where the door could have closed, but you either kept pushing it open to try to figure out a way in, or it just worked out. Yeah, that's great. Jennifer?
Yeah,
What are-
so, there's a lot of stories in my book that talk about obstacles, chance, luck, those sort of things. Just to sort of piggyback on what you mentioned, Eileen, there's a story that Ginger Carrick tells. Ginger Carrick ended up becoming a flight director working in Mission Control. For most of her life, she wanted to be an astronaut from the time that she was 5. She knew. She went and she told her parents after she read a book, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to be an astronaut. Her father ended up dying when she was 11 years old. She faced a tremendous amount of obstacles. I mean, I give so many kudos to her. I mean, she's just an amazing person. She ended up getting a position at NASA. She got called for an interview when she was 26 years old to be an astronaut. She didn't actually think she would make it, but she was very hopeful. And during the medical exam, she found out that she had kidney stones, which was an automatic disqualification from being an astronaut ever. So her lifelong goal and dream of becoming an astronaut would never happen. And so, she was just distraught. She cried all weekend. She didn't know what to do because this was what she wanted to do her entire life. And so she was an instructor for the astronauts. She was working on training the ISS crew members for the first ISS expedition, the second mission as well. And so she started telling herself this little mantra, I can't go into space, but I can take a little bit of something and they'll take it up for me into space and, my dream will come true, kind of that idea. And she kept telling herself this over and over, and eventually she began to believe it. She sort of changed her mindset. And as a result, she said a lot of great things started happening to her at the Johnson Space Center. New positions started opening up to her. She ended up becoming a flight director, and there are even fewer flight directors than there have been astronauts. So, it seemed like a great opportunity, a great career choice for her. She often talks about the fact that she could have taken another path if she had decided, well, this isn't for me, NASA's not for me, I'm going to go somewhere else and do something else and be bitter about that, the fact that she couldn't have been an astronaut, but she decided to just change her mindset and move forward. So I think that's just a great example of, making, as they say, lemonade out of lemons, that kind of thing.
That was one of my favorite stories in your book. That was a really great one, yeah. How about hurdles? Do y'all have some anecdotes about hurdles that came up along the way? I mean, I guess certainly the kidney stones would be a hurdle. But are there any other things that kind of come to mind, or cases where failure?
Well, maybe I can just put out a quick one there. Back when I went through pilot training in 1978, I was very thankful because they were just starting to bring women into flying in the military. So I was very thankful for that. But women were not allowed to fly any combat-rated aircraft like fighters, bombers, reconnaissance that would go into a combat zone, because the concern was a woman being shot down and then becomes a POW. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, at first I was okay with that. I'm like, I'm just happy to be in the military flying. But and actually the guys like to have the women in their class because they more probability of them getting a fighter than if there were women, because the women couldn't get a fighter. So it increased their odds. So the guys actually kind of liked having us around. But we could fly instructor, we could fly tanker, which is air refueling, or transport, like cargo airplanes. And I ended up being an instructor and then cargo. But in 1993, the country opened all aircraft to women. And so that was, almost 15 years later. And I think it was really, I think my generation felt really good that, we had done well enough that the next generation of women had more opportunities. Mm-hmm. So that would be, I would say that was probably a big hurdle. I put in my dream sheet with, I'd asked for an A-10, which is attack, A for attack, A-10. I asked for an RF-4, which was reconnaissance. I asked for, an F-16, F for fighter, and they called me up and said, you can't fly these airplanes, send me a form I can work with. And I wasn't happy with that, but I think looking back at it now, I'm happy that my generation was able to open the doors to the next generation. And the women are doing very well. The women do not have to be 50%. I think that's kind of, let's sign up more women. No, the important thing is that the women have the opportunity to do that if they want. So you've got to only do this if it's what you want to do. Right. If it's your passion.
Yeah. So hurdles, obstacles, yeah. So, as I write in the book, a big part of the story for my dad was a long period of waiting for a flight. He got there right at the end of the Gemini program, didn't get a flight then, understandable. Went through the Apollo program, didn't get a flight. Skylab didn't get a flight. Apollo Soyuz didn't even get a chance to be on that mission. So he got very frustrated, and part of the book is about that whole deal, figuring out who gets a flight when, which is a complicated process, and so he had to deal with that frustration. And part of the problem was that he was not a test pilot like a lot of the early astronauts were. He wasn't exactly a scientist like some of the later astronauts were. So he was sort of stuck in the middle, had to make his own way, and it took him a long time to sort of convince the powers that be that he was ready. And another problem was that NASA didn't really like the idea of a jetpack, of someone flying around outside the spaceship for obvious reasons. You could lose someone that way. And it was sort of a cowboy thing to do, and it took a long time for NASA to sort of be convinced that it might work, and he had to do a lot of that advocacy himself. Initially, when some of the tiles on the shuttle had the unfortunate problem of falling off the shuttle before it returned to Earth, which could have resulted in damage to the orbiter. He proposed that a crewman on the orbiter be outfitted with the MMU who could go out and inspect the orbiter for damage and maybe replace some of the tiles. And that didn't prove to be a very good idea, and NASA fixed the problem another way. But in the early 80s, a little satellite called the Solar Max malfunctioned, and he was able to convince NASA that, hey, this is the perfect opportunity to take the MMU out and grab the satellite, bring it back to the orbiter, and repair it or bring it back to Earth. And that was sort of the thing that got NASA's attention, and he was able. He didn't do it. A couple of the astronauts later went out and got the satellite and brought it back to the orbiter, and so it took a lot of advocacy and being your own, speaking out for yourself, as Eileen had to do in some occasions. Yeah.
I was thinking about this in terms of, okay, this is a book festival. For any of you aspiring authors out there, one of the biggest hurdles that you possibly have is to try to get an agent who's going to work with you, or to get a publisher who wants to publish your book. And when Eileen and I started working together on this, and I thought, okay, this is going to be a sure sell. Publishers are going to be falling all over themselves for it. And we got a bunch of rejection letters. I mean, we got like a dozen rejections from publishers. And for me, it was really interesting watching Eileen's reaction to this, because she was like, okay, well, they're going to be sorry, number one. They're going to realize what they missed out on when this book comes out. But part of what I think one of the things that's great about the book, too, is Eileen's got her 4-step process on how to deal with mistakes or things that go wrong. But what I learned for you publishers, or for you authors out there who want to work with a publisher, is that it's like auditioning for a Broadway show. If the director has in mind a leading man who's in his 30s, who's blonde and 6 feet tall, and you're in your 50s and you're 5'9" and overweight, you're not going to get that role no matter how well you sing. And so what you want to do is you want to find a publisher who shares the same vision that you do. And we got turned down by people for the right reasons, because it wasn't a good fit for them. We found the absolute right agent to work with, and we found the absolutely right publisher to work with who believed in us and was completely in line with us. And so you have to put up with failures sometimes to understand, there's a little bit to learn from that, but I'm not ready to give up yet until I find the right person. And I think that's kind of what happens is this perseverance and hoping that you're going to find somebody that shares your vision about how things can go, and that it's going to be a good match somewhere along the line.
Well, I think, a lot of the women that I feature in the book do talk about hurdles and obstacles, especially in the 1960s when they were working at the Manned Spacecraft Center, which was a true moniker for what was happening at JSC at the time. It really was about men. A lot of women who worked out there were secretaries or administrative folks. One of the women who was an engineer who was trained by Max Vauget, who helped to design the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo spacecraft, was actually mistaken for a secretary because she was sitting behind a desk. She was just a woman, and they were like, oh, you must be a secretary. And she was like, no, you need to re-examine this. I am not a secretary. Go talk to the secretary. A lot of the women just faced some challenges working with men. Some of the women talk about the fact that, guys weren't necessarily interested in what they could do. They were more interested in how they dressed, especially if you were cute. Some of the women expressed concern because they were the only woman in their organization. So a lot of guys thought of them as the example of women. When they would take note of whether or not they spent a lot of time at someone's desk having coffee, what sort of work they turned in. Of course, they were concerned about the future. What would happen if they wanted to hire another woman? Because, of course, there were always discussions about, well, we don't want to hire another woman because X woman didn't do very good work. We don't want another one of them. So you can imagine all the pressure that was on these women in particular. So, I think that there were a lot of obstacles and hurdles for many of these women to overcome.
Thinking about even the physical things that were set up at the firing rooms and the blockhouses at Kennedy Space Center, they didn't even have ladies' rooms in the blockhouse, or in the Launch Control Center had no ladies' rooms. And there was Joanne Morgan, who was the first woman to work there in the firing room, had to be taken to the men's room every time she wanted to freshen up. It was just that kind of prejudice was just built right into the system.
Oh, very, very much. Yeah. If you read, I have an interview with Dottie Lee, who she did some work out at Wallops. She worked for NACA, which was NASA's predecessor agency, and so she would often go out there to launch rockets, and she would be the only woman out there. And she had to go to the bathroom. She was quite young at the time, and she was like, I don't really know that I want to use the restroom. I'm the only girl here. So, you can imagine that there were some other challenges to overcome as well.
I want to throw in a quick story about hurdles. Back to, I know I flew 4 space missions, but honestly, the Air Force stories are kind of the most interesting because it was earlier. So in 1978, when I started pilot training in Enid, Oklahoma, first women on the base. Jonathan's heard this story so many times, but I'm checking out at the commissary, which is the grocery store. Okay, I know that some of the guys didn't want the women there. I mean, most of the guys were great, but there were a few guys that didn't want the women there. So I'm checking out, and the woman behind the cash register, who was a local in Enid, Oklahoma, saw me in my flight suit. Rare sight. Probably the first time she ever saw a woman in a flight suit. She goes, "Oh, are you one of those new women pilots?" I said, "Well, yes." And she said to me, "The wives don't want you here." And I was shocked. And I said, "The wives?" I go, "Oh." I kind of gathered myself, and I said, "Well, why?" And she said, "Well, they don't want you going cross-country with their husbands." And I said, "Well, yeah, that made sense to me."
Yeah.
And I had never thought of it. But, in the military, there's a whole culture. You're like a big family that, we're all, the families support because there's deployments and, there's danger. And so the families really support each other. So I decided I need to get to know the wives. And it was important, I think, for me that they knew I wasn't there trying to find a husband or steal a husband. Thank goodness gracious, I wasn't going to do that. I was there to learn how to be a pilot.
Yeah.
So
You went to a
anyway,
party and like zoomed right in there with the wives.
Yeah. So
right?
I mean, that
Yeah.
story goes on. So so there were 2 of us women. They split our class of 40 into 2 groups of 20. So my group of 20, which was B flight, Bravo flight, had a party. And most of my classmates were guys that were Air Force Academy graduates, married. They like newlyweds. They had just gotten married, graduate, get married, go to pilot training. So I go in the party. Well, the other gal didn't show up. So I'm there, and I got there late because it was awkward. But I walked in. All the guys are over in the dining room talking about the airplane, the checklist, who are the best instructors to get. We called it the gouge, all the stuff you need to know. And all the wives were in the living room talking about base housing. And I specifically remember them talking about the curtains and the problems with the curtains. And I'm like, where do I go?
Yeah.
And I remembered what I heard from that woman in the comment. I'm gonna go meet the wives. And, they had their own, it was hard on them too, being out in the middle of nowhere and away from their families, newlyweds, and their new husbands working 16, 18-hour days. So I got to know the wives, and I still keep in touch with some of them even today. So, sometimes you just can't be thinking about yourself. You got to put yourself in the other person's shoes.
That's great. I have other questions, but I promised I would open it to the floor, and we have about 10 minutes left. So, yes, please, just project. Go ahead, in the white.
First of all, thank you all for coming and telling your stories. It's been very informative and interesting. My question is for Mr. McCandless. I was lucky enough to get an advance copy of the book. I know some people over at Night Planet Press. And what struck me was the detail in describing some of your dad's exploits. And one of them in particular was your dad is taken off on an aircraft carrier. And he, something malfunctions and he's fighting it and he has to eject. And it's like you were there. I mean, it's so amazing. And so I got to thinking, how could that have been? So I know you write novels and they're fabulous, but could there have been a little bit of what they call creative? When someone reads your book and thinks, did you make up any of this stuff?
I don't know what you're implying, sir. The thing about my dad was, and it made the book a lot easier to write, is he kept literally every piece of paper he'd ever touched. And he actually had retained the investigative file that the Navy opened on that accident, that F-4 accident. And so I was able to pull out witness statements and descriptions of the aircraft and the Navy's final adjudication of what had happened, and some of the witness statements were my dad's own statements. So I used those to craft the narrative, as they say, with only a bare minimum of imaginative retelling. So it did have to be a narrative after all. So, but thank you. Yeah.
Yes, in the Yeti.
Colonel Collins, what was it like going to and returning from space your very first time versus your very last time? And is it thrilling in the moment, or are you so focused on instruments and safety that you kind of have to reflect on that afterward more?
Yeah, so his question was the first mission that you flew, and comparing that to the last mission that you flew, any differences? And then I think the second part was, was it thrilling, or maybe just what was the launch like? So one of the stories I tell, actually it's in the opening, it used to be chapter 1, but we changed it to the prologue. But I talk about what it feels like to launch into space. And I guarantee space tourism will be extremely successful someday. I mean, that launch is, I described it as best I could in the book. You might want to compare it to like a roller coaster ride or something like that, but a lot of people remember the Challenger accident on launch, and there wasn't really anything that the astronauts could do about that, but you do, all the control that you have over something like that takes place in the planning process. In the actual day itself, you don't have control over the boosters, for example. So, you worry about your family because your family is like, they're all sweating it thinking about the Challenger accident. That's just human nature. But the launch itself, I think, is all of your senses, your vision. It's like you're flying through a thunderstorm when you see all the lights flashing. 3 of my launches were at night, so you've got all the lights flashing. And then the sound, it sounds like you're in a room that's burning. The quality of the sound is the same as what you hear when you watch a launch, which I find interesting. The quality of the sound is exactly the same. And then there's what you feel. There's all that shaking going on. Especially the winter launches, because you launch through the jet stream and your solid rocket booster gimbals are trying to get you on a certain path, and they're like slamming around, rock and tilt. And when you launch in the winter, there's just a lot more of this slamming around going on. And like I tell people, if you try to write, you'd never be able to read it because it would be a big mess. And that's why the switches were so big. Why are those switches so big? Why are those buttons so big? Because your hand's going like this. You don't want to get the wrong one. And then, I could go on, but, and by the way, the summer launches were smoother. Some people say the boosters are poured, the solid rocket boosters, they're poured differently, but I think it has a lot more to do with the winds that the jet stream's up at 40,000 feet. It has a lot more to do with the fact that you're getting blown off course when you launch. And I want to say something about my first versus my last mission. I had a little trouble adapting to zero gravity on my first flight. It took me like a day. and I even took some Phenergan to keep from getting air sick or space sick. There's two things that happen. You have the fluid shift, so your face gets really fat and your legs get really skinny, and that makes you feel uncomfortable. And then there's the second thing that happens is the fact that you have no gravity, you have to rely on your vision, and you can't really like feel where the ground is. And if you're like working on your checklist and your body will just like rotate and you don't know it and you look up and like the floor is up there and you're like, whoa, where am I? That'll make you sick. And so, but we have doctor-approved Phenergan, which is an anti-nausea drug that you can take to help get rid of that, and it works very well. That only happened to me on my first flight, and I really think your body learns my second, third, and fourth flight much easier going up. But I say, the older you get, the easier it is to go up, but the harder it is to come back. Because when you come back to Earth, you're back in the gravity field again, and as you get older, I find like in my case, my muscles deteriorated faster on my last flight. I think my blood pressure went sky high when I came back from my last flight. And I think that the doctors are studying this, but I thought early on, my grandmother, she died when she was 89. I remember she had trouble getting out of the car, getting out of her chair. She always needed help. And I'm up in space thinking, gee, my grandmother could do everything up here. She doesn't have to fight gravity. But then she wouldn't be able to come home. She'd probably die coming back into the gravity field because of, you really have to have a strong heart to go, because you go up in space, your heart gets lazy, right? It's just not working against gravity. So even if you're exercising, your muscles and your heart still get lazy. And you come back, depending on the individual person's health. I used to think, great, fly are elderly people and they can have a great time up there, but you got to be healthy enough to come back. Then I could go on and on. I could talk for an hour on your question, but thank you. But I did write a lot about it in the book, and it's very hard. The hardest thing for me to describe, and I was on the phone with Jonathan. I don't really have the words for this. I'm trying to see if maybe he could help me. I was in the airlock on the space station, and there's these bags all around me. This is my last flight, so I kind of knew how to get around in microgravity, but all these bags are around me, and they're these big white burlap bags with equipment in them. And I was working in my checklist. And I had been doing it for maybe 5 minutes, and then I looked up, and I couldn't see the ceiling, the floor, the wall. I had no idea where I was. I didn't have gravity to tell me which way was down. All these bags, I felt like it was the strangest feeling of, I have no control over where I am and what I'm doing. I have no idea where I am. And I couldn't, even writing the book, I couldn't find the right words to describe it. But it was very uncomfortable, and I had to get these bags out of the way, and where am I? Where's the wall? I think the 2001 Space Odyssey, they probably did a little bit of a job trying to describe that feeling, where that was the spaceship they were trying to make some kind of artificial gravity by spinning the machine. But anyway, sorry I'm talking so long, but it's just a almost indescribable feeling, but I will say space tourism will be extremely successful. Because of the human experience, the cost has got to come down and it's got to get safer, and that's going to take a while.
Yeah.
But I'm not telling anybody to invest in it right now, but but it might be a long-term investment. And by the way, I don't own any stock.
We have time, I think, for one more quick one. If we have, in the back. Yeah.
I also want to know your opinion about the beginning of the space program, focusing with Navy pilots, and then moving to Air Force, and now going to privatization with the SpaceX type of launches.
Let somebody else answer that. Privatization. I think the question was on privatization.
One of the questions we had started to talk about was, I heard this at a conference I was at a couple of weeks ago, that some young people in the audience, some young women in the audience were saying, that I wasn't excited about Apollo because none of the astronauts looked like me. And, when I think back to growing up in that era, those Mercury, Gemini, Apollo astronauts were all supermen, your father included. They were prime physical specimens. They were, the sharpest guys you could possibly imagine, but they didn't represent, they represented the best of who we could send up there, the best physical specimens at the time, but they didn't represent us as a population. And I think what we're starting to see now more and more, and this started with the first class of space shuttle astronauts, was that we're getting more inclusivity in the astronaut corps, as well as in mission control and all the other jobs at NASA. Hidden Figures was a great book to be able to bring out the need, that everybody has something to contribute, whether or not you're going to be an astronaut or not. But I think what we're starting to see now is the doors opening to so many more people that can do things. I think one of the things that we talked about in the book was that whether there was an intentional glass ceiling or not, there are a lot of times when we have things that are part of our system that discriminate against people, whether it's intentional or not. The fact that NASA never said at the beginning that women can't be astronauts, but they said you have to be a test pilot, and you couldn't get into test pilot school if you were a woman. So that was, it was a roundabout way of keeping people out. From a personal standpoint, I can't fly in space because I'm colorblind. That's 8% of the population of men. I found out there was one space shuttle astronaut who flew colorblind. He managed to fool the medical examiners. He flew one mission, but I mean, there's ways we've got to be able to increase more people. And I think one of the other things that I talk about, I do a talk about space tourism and commercialization. And one of the things that Eileen said was that she could have kept flying after her last mission, but there were still 50 people in the astronaut corps who hadn't flown yet. And she wanted to give everybody a chance to do that. And I point now to like William Shatner when he flew and he came back from that space, the Blue Origin mission, and he was clearly a changed person from doing that, from the chance of getting this, what they call the overview effect, where you see the Earth as a whole and realize how fragile the world is. We need more and more people to go up and experience that and to share that with the rest of us so that we can really start taking environmental protection a lot more seriously. I think this is one of those kind of things. We've got to realize that it's up to us to take better care of the Earth, and you can only kind of get that feeling by getting a chance to see it in the big picture like that. So we need to see more people up there to do that.
Great. I think that's all we have time for, but thank you again, everybody, so much. And again, thank you to the panelists, to the book festival, and just as a reminder, the authors will be down on Congress Avenue right after this. Thank you.